And in verse 2, Jesus calls a child to him, and he says, not only that the greatest in his kingdom is the one who takes this lowly position of a child, he says, but that unless you take that position, you can't even enter his kingdom. So the question we have this morning is, what does it mean to take the lowly position of a child? And what is this picture of greatness that Jesus is painting for us here? Well, to understand what's going on here, you first need to have a frame of reference shift, right? See, children in the ancient world were seen a little bit differently than children in our world, right? See, today in our world, children are incredibly important. In a lot of ways, in our society, children are kind of worshipped as little gods around which everything in life rotates around, right? That wasn't the way children were viewed in the ancient world. Just spoiler alert, that's not how historically children have been viewed. Now, don't get me wrong here. Children in the ancient world, they were loved, they were seen as a blessing, but they weren't despised, but they certainly were not the center of attention. You see, children were not high and mighty, they were low and weak. One commentator writes it this way. He says, the most powerless members of ancient society were little children. In most of ancient society, age increased one's social status and authority. And as such, children had no status, they had no power, they had no privileges, get this, apart from what they had received as total dependence of their parents. Children had no status, no power, no privileges, except what they had received from their parents. You see, and that's the attitude that Jesus is getting at. You see, Jesus' followers are not great achievers who earn some incredible, who kind of carve out this niche of their greatness in his kingdom. It says Jesus' kingdom people, for all they have and all they are, they depend on the Father who has given it to them. They cannot earn a status. They cannot get a privilege. They have no power of their own, no way to gain it themselves. They are wholly, entirely dependent on their Father in heaven who has given it to them. You see what Jesus is saying? He's telling these disciples, he's saying, I have spent the last 3 years preaching to you. I've spent the last 3 years talking to you about this gospel of grace. You see, he says, until you get that you are a sinner just like everyone else who had no status and no power and no privilege before God, and until you get that the only thing that you actually deserve is punishment for your sin, not blessing, not privilege, until you get that like a little child, you aren't loved or accepted or adopted into God's family because of your high status, but in fact, in spite of your low status, until you get that, your entrance into my kingdom, until you get that Jesus' kingdom, the way you get in is not based on who you are and what you do, but on who Jesus is and what he has done and your faith in him. Until that clicks, you will never have the attitude of a child in Jesus' kingdom. You see, because you will always think that you have earned it and you have deserved it, and there is something about you that has weaked your way in, or that has earned God's favor, that you are better than someone else, that you are more worthy or more honorable or more privileged, and that's a lie from the pit of hell. And Jesus says, unless you take the lowly position of a child, not only will you never be great, you can't even get into the kingdom. D.A. Carson sums Jesus' words up this way. He says, being childlike is about recognizing your vulnerability and your absolute dependence on God. You see, Jesus says you have to take the position of a child. A child is completely vulnerable. They are totally dependent on their parents. Jesus says that's the kind of attitude you need to have with God if you're going to be a part of my kingdom. See, this is the essence of humility. It is an accurate view of who you are before God. You are vulnerable and entirely dependent. You see, the truth is that apart from the grace of Jesus, we stand before God as mutinous rebels, condemned in our sin, hopeless and helpless. Our status as God's adopted children, as members of his kingdom, has nothing to do with your greatness. You see, and it's only when that truth clicks in your heart that the reality becomes clear that you'll be able to become like a little child who is greatest in Jesus' kingdom by being wholly dependent on the King. But it's really important that you see one other thing about what it means to be a child in Jesus' kingdom. You see, children don't just understand they're vulnerable and they're dependent on their parents. You see, they understand that they're loved by their parents, and that changes everything. Even as I try to discipline my kids and shape their hearts and help mold them, I always try to close any disciplined conversation I have with them by saying, Emma, Caleb, you know that I love you, right? Because I love you, you can obey. My heart for them is that I love them and I long for their good. And more than anything, even in the discipline, I want them to know that I love them and I long for their good. My kids, every morning, they run to me. They run to me every morning. They hop in my lap. They want to be held. They want to be enjoyed. And they know that there is nothing that would keep me from holding them. They are loved not because of what they do, because of who they are. You see, children get that. They get that it's not their status, it's not their power, it's not their privilege that makes them loved, it's who they are. You see, when you realize that you've been adopted into God's family and that in spite of who you are and in spite of all that you have done, you are loved and enjoyed and cherished, you need to hear me. That frees you. That frees you. I know that all of us do not have that kind of a relationship with our parents. I know that this world is full of sin and has marred the relationships that we have with family oftentimes. But Jesus says, this is the kind of relationship that I tell you that God wants to have with you. He's a good father who loves his kids desperately, who longs for their good. You see, when you get that you are loved, that you are adopted, not based on what you have done and who you are, but based on who Jesus is, that frees you.